trees are a great subject. Often we focus though so much on the leaves because they are such a challenge that we're actually not bringing the same thoughtfulness to the trunks and to the major branches. So let me explain in this video my thinking and demonstrate my process for that. And let me say here that at the end, after I actually finish drawing this scene as much as I'm going to draw it, there is a tip that I reveal that I use constantly, not just in drawings of trees, but in many different subjects. But it's particularly helpful for this scene, and it's not just showing you this trick that I have, but also explaining more fully how it helps me in drawing the values of this. And particularly that's important for the cross-hatching, which is often a problem for people when they're starting to draw. So you can see what I do at the start. What I avoid doing is what so often people do when they start drawing trunks, which is to draw defining straight lines on either side. Now, it's really hard to do that well and to capture the three-dimensional form of this tree. See, it's not a ribbon stuck on the paper. It's actually a tube that moves in space, comes towards us, curves away from us, leans, and we want to capture that sense in our drawing, in our marks, so that by the end we have that sense of three-dimensional tubing, twisting and turning and leaning in space, sometimes coming towards us, sometimes going away from us. So we want to put as much reality into this as we can. And I find that by starting with tentative edges for the trunks is very helpful. And also because it can let us slightly change those edges if they're a little bit too far out or not far out enough. Or perhaps they don't bulge in a way that the curvature of the trunk would indicate. And we also have to line up what's happening with the outside edge on each side of the trunk. And that can be difficult to do when we're just drawing continuous lines. It's not so much straight lines as continuous unbroken lines. They don't create the effect of the edges that we often want, particularly when the bark is very rough. Not the case with this bark particularly, because most of this bark, as you'll see around the base, has actually fallen off, and now we have the smooth, fresh bark for this current year just starting to weather. The other thing that's often a weak area of trees is where the tree hits the ground. Just as where buildings hit the ground is often a weak spot. And again, we rush to do often a straight line or fairly continuous lines at least, defining this border between tree and ground. And yet, when we look at what's there in life, in this particular case, it's a lot of bark heaped up around the base, but it could be leaves or it could be sticks and stones and gravel and other things. None of these things are well represented by a continuous line. So we want to not take shortcuts that probably derive more from cartoon-like drawings that we've seen, particularly in our childhood, but we want to find marks that capture the visual feel, the visual effect of what we're seeing. So as you can see, I'm continuing to now strengthen some of these outline marks. And I've also used hatching to indicate that grey patching that we have where the old trunk, where the old bark hasn't come off yet. And so we want to establish that before we start hatching for the shade on the tree. Well, at least that's the way I like to do it. And that way we get the relative values of that darker area towards, as opposed to the lighter areas of the trunk, consistent under the shading. So you can see me now working on the values, the darkness. Values is just an art word for lights and darks. But they are important, and I'm going to exaggerate them somewhat for this demonstration, but also simply to create a more interesting drawing. I don't intend to draw the background particularly, which means I want to put a little more interest, contrast, attention in the front. In the reference, we largely, or perhaps most immediately, most easily see these trunks because of the darker value from the foliage behind. But since I'm not going to be capturing that, I'm going to tweak the darknesses that we have in the shade and that we have just in some of the colours as well, the local colours, particularly down the base. And if you're finding this interesting, then please hit the like button for me right now before you forget. And I do have a Drawing Trees playlist, which is, it's got dozens and dozens and dozens of videos on it now, but it's really all things foliage. So it includes other videos on drawing branches and trunks, bare winter branches, as well as foliage of every type, size, scale of tree and shrub. You can imagine pine trees, fir trees, deciduous trees, trees with large leaves, trees with small trees, trees from close up, trees from far away, shrubs, even includes grass, blades of grass, and flowers as well. So all things foliage and plants, you'll find on that playlist. There's a huge range of things on it. I'll put a link using the end screen if you're interested in having a look at my Drawing Trees playlist. There's no reason why trees can't be a fun, enjoyable, and relatively straightforward drawing experience if we come to understand them in the most helpful way for our drawing technique. So now coming down the bottom, now you'll notice that I've done my primary hatching mark direction horizontally. I almost always do this when I do trees and trunks. That's partly because I think it better reflects the underlying form from the direction we're looking at it from, sort of like a series of cross sections, and we can get some subtlety in terms of our curvature in our hatching to reflect the underlying shape of the tree. And also the perspective from what we're viewing it as. If we're looking straight on or looking up or looking down, we can shift the curvature of those hatching lines just slightly to capture that. Now around the base, I just want to suggest the curled up bark that's lying around. This is where understanding perspective and foreshortening is really important, because the things that are closer will be larger, and as they move away, they become narrower as well as less wide very quickly. I need to reduce the size of my marks and the closeness or the distance between things, more the case, very much as I go backwards. If I want to get a sense of these things are closer and now this ground is moving into the distance. So have a look at what I'm doing here. Don't forget, at the end, after I finish this, there is a great tip for drawing, well, anything, but trees in particular. I find this helpful for, and there are some additional really helpful things that flow from that tip with the hatching. So if you're getting a bit impatient, don't miss that, just skip to that. But I hope you don't skip, I hope you see me now. Just work out a little bit of the background to draw, to give a bit of context, but to still leave this tree trunk as the major subject. A little bit of defining now of the edges. I never intended those initial marks to be the final marks, but they would help me position the tree. And notice how much more effective, even in a relatively smooth-sided tree, not having a continuous line is, just having a few little breaks that can help suggest, capture the visual effect of changing direction slightly at that point. Doing some of the further grasses or darker areas at the base of the further trees and shrubs and grasses, just to give a bit of a horizon feel. And also just hinting one of those small wattle trees in the distance. I'm drawing with a 0.2mm pen, and you've been watching this at double real-time drawing speed. So if you slow the video down to half speed, you can watch me draw this real time. What do you think? Is it looking three-dimensional? I said I'd show you a little tip at the end, which I find very helpful for things such as tree trunks. I use this with other subjects as well. And that's, I do a black and white version of my color print. But I just don't desaturate what I have in my color version. I actually play around with it to enhance the values, the relative values in this scene. So with this one, I particularly increase the contrast to see the difference between the brightest areas and the darkest areas. And I also did that to see exactly where the darkest areas were and what that told me about the shape of the tree. So for instance, by seeing how dark this was here, but then how below this it's not in nearly as much shade, that tells me that this branch is actually moving towards me from this point, and therefore more of it is in shade than this lower down section. It's not as obvious in the color version. But the more fully we can understand the three-dimensional form of the branches and trees, how they move in space in relation to us as the observer, then the more accurately and hopefully the more easily we can find marks to create the effect that change of position in relation to us causes. The other thing that this shows, I think, is the way the light bounces around and how the darker section isn't usually right on this edge, but just back a little bit from it. So the darkest sections are actually here in terms of value. And so while there is certainly shade right up to the silhouette edge that we have, the darkest shade is just set back slightly into the trunk from that edge. And it's the same over here too. We can see that this value here is darker than on each side. And again, that indicates a shift in direction of this branch from around here upwards. Just realized this is actually a different pen. This is 0.5, not the 0.2 that I used elsewhere. But I just wanted to add a bit of darker value there, just to show the difference that playing around with value and with considering what's behind can have in how we render our foreground subject and how the foreground subject ends up looking. That we can define edges sharply both by having dark on light, but also by having light on dark. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope you found this helpful, hope you found it interesting. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. Trees are a fantastic subject, but hey, we don't want the perfect tree canopies we eventually can draw to be spoilt by trunks and large branches that aren't up to the same level. So why not focus sometimes just on the trunks, just on the branches, see how you go. You'll find this reference, of course, on my channel community page. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, whatever techniques or strategies you use to get there, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.